Imagine living a quiet, content life, only to have it shattered by a single act of kindness. That's exactly what happened to Daniel Matthews, a humble bookstore owner in a small town who thought he was just helping a stranger on a stormy night. But what if I told you that one moment of compassion would make him a target of powerful people with dark secrets? What if, by saving a life, he unknowingly put his own on the line? Today, you'll find out how Daniel's simple gesture spiraled into a twisted game of manipulation, betrayal, and a choice that could destroy everything he holds dear. What was it about this stranger that drew dangerous forces to Daniel's doorstep? And why was he the one they wanted to control? Stay with me, because this is a story of kindness that turned into a nightmare. A nightmare that might be closer than you think. The small town of Lakeside had always been a place where everyone knew each other's name, a place untouched by the rush of the outside world. Tucked away from the city's chaos, it was a town where time seemed to move at its own leisurely pace. Among the handful of shops lining the quiet main street stood a humble little bookstore called Matthews Reads, owned by a man who seemed as timeless as the town itself, Daniel Matthews. Daniel, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his early 60s, with graying hair and a face marked by years of both struggle and wisdom, had become something of a fixture in the town. People admired him not just for his collection of books, but for the warmth he radiated and the quiet strength in his demeanor. His presence was like an anchor, a gentle reminder of stability and kindness in a world that was often too chaotic. But behind his gentle smile and soft-spoken manner, there was more to Daniel than met the eye. Life had not always been easy for him. He had lost his wife to illness years ago, and with no children of his own, poured his energy into his little bookstore. It was his sanctuary, a place where stories lived and dreams came alive. Every morning he'd open the creaky wooden door, greet the regulars, and settle into his routine. He knew which books each visitor liked, remembered their birthdays, and even lent out books for free to kids whose parents couldn't afford them. For Daniel, it wasn't about the money. It was about the connections, the quiet moments of shared humanity. But Lakeside had changed in recent years. Big chain stores had moved in, and the once thriving community of local shops had begun to wither. Daniel's bookstore, too, had seen its fair share of tough times. He wasn't one to complain, but the shelves were starting to look a little emptier, and he'd been dipping into his savings to keep the doors open. Yet even as business dwindled, Daniel refused to compromise his values. He could have sold the place for a good profit and retired comfortably. But something inside him just couldn't let go of the store. Maybe it was the memories, or maybe it was the promise he'd made to his late wife to always keep their dreams alive. So every night, Daniel would lock up the shop, turn off the lights, and walk the few blocks back to his small, weathered home. A place that was just as modest as his business. His evenings were spent reading by the flickering light of an old lamp, sipping herbal tea, and occasionally flipping through the old family photo albums. It was a quiet life, a good life, but it was a life teetering on the edge of uncertainty, and deep down, Daniel knew it. It was on one of those chilly autumn evenings, as the wind howled outside and the streets were deserted, that something happened to break the monotony of Daniel's simple existence. He had just turned the sign on the front door to "closed" and was reaching for his coat when he noticed a figure huddled under the awning outside. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind whipped through the street, making it nearly impossible to see clearly. But there was no mistaking the silhouette. A young man, slumped and shivering, his clothes soaked through. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. It was late, and a stranger loitering outside was not a common sight in Lakeside. But then he caught a glimpse of the young man's face, pale and etched with pain. Without another thought, Daniel opened the door and stepped out into the rain. "Hey there," he called gently, his deep voice cutting through the storm. "You all right?" The young man looked up, startled. He was in his early 20s, with a gaunt frame and eyes that spoke of more than just physical pain. They carried a weight, a darkness, as if he was running from something that had left scars far deeper than the ones visible on his skin. "Please, I'm not—" the young man stammered, his voice barely audible over the rain. He tried to straighten up, but winced, clutching his side. "You're hurt," Daniel said softly. "Come inside, son. Let's get you dried off." There was a flash of hesitation, a flicker of something almost like fear in the young man's eyes. But then, perhaps too exhausted to argue, he nodded and let Daniel guide him inside the warm, cozy bookstore. The bell over the door jingled softly as Daniel led him to the small back room, where a battered old couch and a worn-out blanket awaited. "Sit here," Daniel said firmly but kindly. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a towel, a steaming cup of tea, and a first aid kit. The young man watched him, eyes wide with a mix of gratitude and confusion. "Why are you helping me?" he whispered. "Because you look like you could use it," Daniel replied simply, kneeling beside him to inspect a nasty gash on the boy's side, "and because it's the right thing to do." The young man seemed to struggle with this answer, as if it were foreign to him. He took a shaky breath, eyes darting around nervously. I, I'm Noah," he managed, wincing as Daniel cleaned the wound. "Daniel," the older man replied with a smile, wrapping a bandage around his torso. "Just take it easy, Noah. You're safe here." Safe. That word seemed to hang in the air, almost mocking in its irony. Because as Noah lay back on the couch, his eyes fluttering shut from exhaustion, Daniel couldn't help but notice the bruises, the way his hands trembled even when still. This was not just a young man caught out in a storm. This was someone fleeing from something much bigger, something dangerous. Daniel sat beside him in silence, wondering what kind of trouble this stranger had brought to his doorstep. Whatever it was, he'd find out soon enough. Because when kindness meets mystery, it has a way of unraveling the fabric of the quietest lives, exposing them to storms far more powerful than a rainy autumn night. As Daniel turned off the lights and locked the door once more, he felt a shiver run down his spine. A strange feeling washed over him, an instinct that whispered this was only the beginning. Whatever Noah was running from, Daniel's life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. And so the storm outside raged on. But the real storm? That was just getting started. Daniel sat quietly beside the young man, watching as Noah's breathing gradually steadied. The soft ticking of the bookstore's old clock filled the silence, and for a while everything seemed almost serene. But Daniel couldn't shake the unease that crept up his spine every time he looked at Noah's battered form. Who was this boy? What kind of trouble was he running from? And why had he ended up here, at his doorstep, on such a stormy night? The questions tumbled through his mind, but Daniel held them back. For now, this young man needed rest and safety, not interrogation. After a few moments, Noah stirred, blinking groggily as his gaze landed on Daniel. His expression shifted, a flicker of fear sparking in his eyes as if he had just remembered where he was. "Easy now," Daniel murmured, keeping his voice gentle. "You're okay. Just rest." Noah sat up slowly, wincing as the movement tugged at the fresh bandage on his side. He looked around the small back room, taking in the dusty shelves stacked with old books, the cracked but clean teacup beside him, and the old man watching him with patient concern. There was no malice in Daniel's gaze, no judgment, just genuine compassion. It seemed to confuse Noah, and he shifted uneasily. Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice raspy. Daniel leaned back, studying him thoughtfully. "Because someone's got to. And besides," he added with a small smile, "I don't get a lot of visitors after hours." Noah gave a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "You don't even know who I am. What if I'm dangerous?" "I'll take my chances," Daniel replied calmly, his eyes steady on Noah's. "You don't strike me as the kind of person looking to cause trouble." Noah's gaze dropped to his lap, and for a moment the young man looked utterly lost, vulnerable. But then, just as quickly, a mask of indifference slid back over his face. He reached for his jacket, a worn, thin thing that did nothing to ward off the chill, and struggled to his feet. "I shouldn't stay," he muttered. "I'm putting you at risk just by being here." "You're not going anywhere," Daniel said firmly, standing up and placing a steadying hand on Noah's shoulder. "Not until you're in better shape." Noah flinched at the touch, his entire body tense and coiled like a spring. Daniel quickly removed his hand, stepping back to give him space. He could see the fight-or-flight response flickering in Noah's eyes, and it made his heart ache. Whoever this boy was, he was clearly scared out of his mind, scared enough to lash out at someone offering help, Listen, Daniel said softly, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. I'm not here to pry. Just stay for the night. Get some rest. In the morning, if you still want to go, I won't stop you. Noah hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door. For a moment, Daniel thought he was going to bolt right then and there. But then something seemed to shift in his expression, something like exhaustion or maybe resignation. Slowly, he sank back down onto the couch, his shoulders slumping. Okay, he whispered, almost to himself. Just for the night. Daniel let out a quiet breath of relief. He pulled a faded quilt from a nearby chair and draped it gently over Noah's shivering form. Good. I'll be just upstairs if you need anything. He turned to leave, but Noah's voice stopped him. Wait. Daniel paused, glancing back. Noah's face was shadowed in the dim light, but his eyes shone with a mixture of desperation and gratitude that made Daniel's chest tighten. Thank you, Noah murmured, his voice barely more than a breath. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't. Don't worry about it, Daniel cut in softly, shaking his head. Just rest, son. We'll talk more in the morning. With that, Daniel made his way up the narrow staircase to his small, cluttered living quarters above the bookstore. But even as he lay down in his bed, sleep eluded him. Questions swirled in his mind, and a strange sense of foreboding settled in his chest. What kind of trouble could a boy like Noah have gotten into? And what did it mean that he thought staying here would put Daniel at risk? The rain continued to pound against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of thunder echoed through the night. Daniel turned onto his side, staring out at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. Somehow he knew. This wasn't going to be a simple case of giving a stranger shelter for the night. There was something darker lurking beneath the surface, something that made his instincts scream a warning. And in the morning, when Daniel awoke, he found his suspicions confirmed. The first thing he noticed was the silence. No creak of floorboards, no rustling of blankets. He sat up slowly, heart sinking as he realized what it meant. Noah was gone. Daniel hurried down the stairs, half expecting to find the back door open and the storm still raging outside. But instead he found something else, a folded piece of paper lying on the old chipped coffee table. His name was scrawled on the front in shaky handwriting. With a frown, Daniel picked it up and unfolded it. Thank you for your kindness. Expect the unexpected. The words sent a chill down his spine. He stared at the note, trying to make sense of it. Why would Noah leave something like this? And what did it mean? Expect the unexpected. Before he could ponder it further, a knock sounded at the front door, startling him. Daniel glanced up, frowning. Who would be visiting this early, especially in this weather? With a sense of unease prickling at the back of his neck, he made his way to the entrance and pulled the door open. Standing on the doorstep was a delivery man, soaked to the bone. He held a large rectangular box wrapped in brown paper. Delivery for Daniel Matthews? He asked. Daniel blinked. I didn't order anything. The man shrugged. It's paid for. No sender's information, but it's addressed to you. He handed the package to Daniel, nodded and turned to leave. Daniel stood there for a moment, staring at the box in his hands. It was heavy, and something inside shifted slightly as he moved it. With a growing sense of dread, he set it down on the counter and carefully peeled away the wrapping. Inside was a thick, hardcover book, pristine, its cover gleaming under the dim light. But when Daniel opened it, his breath caught in his throat. Nestled in a hollowed-out section of the pages was a stack of crisp $100 bills. Thousands of dollars at least. Daniel stepped back, his heart pounding. What on earth? He glanced around the empty shop, as if expecting someone to jump out and explain the bizarre delivery. But there was no one, just the rain tapping against the windows and the eerie silence that followed Noah's sudden disappearance. Expect the unexpected, Daniel whispered, staring down at the money. Whatever he had gotten himself into, it was clear now. This was no random encounter. Someone, maybe even Noah, had chosen him. And for reasons Daniel couldn't begin to understand, he had just become part of something much, much bigger, and from the looks of it, much more dangerous. Daniel stood in the middle of his small bookstore, staring down at the pile of money hidden within the pages of that mysterious book. Thousands of dollars. just sitting there, as if it were some kind of twisted gift. He felt his heart thumping wildly in his chest, a mixture of disbelief and suspicion churning in his gut. This wasn't a donation. It was too deliberate, too calculated. But why? And what did it have to do with Noah? A chill ran down his spine. He thought back to the young man's terrified expression, the way he had flinched at every sound, every sudden movement. Daniel could tell that fear hadn't come from nowhere. Noah was hiding from something, or someone, something dangerous. And now it seemed whatever had been chasing Noah was beginning to set its sights on him. "Expect the unexpected," Daniel muttered, glancing again at the note Noah had left behind. He closed the book slowly, sliding it back into the box as if it might explode in his hands. This kind of money, this wasn't a gift. It was a message. But what message? A warning? A bribe? Before he could contemplate it any further, the bell above the front door jingled softly. Daniel's head snapped up, his nerves already on edge. A man stood in the doorway, a stranger dressed in a sleek black coat, his face half hidden beneath the brim of a dark hat. He looked out of place, like a shadow that had wandered into the warm, book-lined world of Daniel's shop. "Good morning, Mr. Matthews," the man said smoothly, his voice as polished as his appearance. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, glancing around the store as if he were appraising every inch of it. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Daniel took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders. "Who are you, and how do you know my name?" The man smiled faintly, as if Daniel's reaction amused him. "Names are just formalities, Mr. Matthews. What's more important is why I'm here." He reached into his coat and produced a slim, elegant envelope. "I represent an organization that takes a keen interest in people who stand out." Daniel's gaze narrowed. "What kind of organization?" The man ignored his question, setting the envelope carefully on the counter. "Consider this an offer. Our way of showing appreciation for the small but meaningful impact you've had on this community. Your generosity, your kindness, those are qualities we value highly, and we believe they should be rewarded." Daniel's eyes flicked down to the envelope, then back to the man's face. "I'm not looking for any reward," he said quietly. "I don't know who you are or what you think I've done, but You saved someone's life, Mr. Matthews," the man interrupted softly. "That kind of action sends ripples, far and wide. It's not every day someone is willing to help a stranger at great personal risk." Daniel's blood ran cold. "Who are you talking about?" The man's smile widened ever so slightly. "Does it matter?" he asked. Then, without waiting for an answer, he gestured to the envelope. "Inside, you'll find an invitation, a chance to take what you built here and elevate it to something far greater. Imagine your little bookstore, but with branches in every major city. Imagine your name becoming synonymous with education, with community, with hope. It's all within your reach, Mr. Matthews. All you have to do is say yes." Daniel stared at him, disbelief and anger warring within him. "This store isn't a business venture. It's not a franchise. It's my life's work, and I'm not interested in selling it off to strangers." The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "This isn't about selling, Mr. Matthews. It's about growth, influence, making a real difference." "Influence?" Daniel shook his head, taking a step back. "I'm just a small-town bookseller. I'm not looking for power or influence. I'm looking to serve my community. And that's exactly why we're interested in you," the man said softly. "People trust you. They look up to you. Imagine what you could do with the right backing, with the right partners." Daniel felt a surge of frustration. "Who are you?" he demanded. "And why are you so interested in me?" The man tilted his head, studying Daniel for a long moment. Then, with a small, almost regretful smile, he turned and walked to the door. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Matthews. Think about the offer." And just like that, he was gone, leaving Daniel standing there in a stunned silence, the envelope still lying unopened on the counter. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and mounting anxiety. The mysterious man's visit seemed to set off a chain reaction of strange events. One by one, more visitors began showing up at the store, each more polished and well-dressed than the last. each offering some variation of the same proposal: a partnership, a business expansion, a chance to be a beacon of change. They all spoke in the same smooth, rehearsed tones, their eyes sharp and calculating. And every time Daniel refused, their smiles would tighten, their eyes would darken ever so slightly, and they would leave with a polite but ominous promise: "We'll be in touch." By the end of the week, Daniel was on edge. He had taken to locking the door early, drawing the blinds, and avoiding answering the phone unless he recognized the number. Whatever this group was, they were persistent and powerful. He could feel the pressure building, an invisible noose tightening around his quiet, peaceful life. And then, just when he thought things couldn't get any stranger, Victoria Cartwright walked into his store. There was no mistaking her. She swept through the door with an air of effortless elegance, her tailored suit and immaculate makeup radiating power and authority. She moved like a queen surveying her kingdom, her eyes sharp as she took in the rows of books and the cluttered little counter where Daniel stood frozen, watching her. "Mr. Matthews," she said warmly, extending a manicured hand. "It's such a pleasure to finally meet you." Daniel took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "I'm guessing you're with the same organization as all the others," he said quietly, shaking her hand briefly. She smiled, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "You could say that, but I'm not like the others, Mr. Matthews. I'm here to make a real offer, an offer that, I think, you'll find much harder to refuse." "Is that so?" Daniel asked dryly. "It is," Victoria replied smoothly. She stepped closer, her gaze intense. "You have a gift, Mr. Matthews, a gift for connecting with people, for making a difference in their lives. My organization wants to help you expand that gift, to give you the resources and support to turn this small bookstore into a nationwide movement. Imagine a string of community centers, educational programs, literacy initiatives, all under your name." Daniel's heart pounded. "Why? Why would you want to do that for me?" "Because people like you are rare," Victoria said softly. "People who care, who give, who inspire trust. With your influence and our resources, we could build something truly extraordinary, something that would change lives." Daniel stared at her, torn between suspicion and a strange, compelling curiosity. There was something about Victoria, something more honest than the others. But still, there was a darkness in her eyes, a hunger that made his skin prickle. "And what if I say no?" he asked quietly. Victoria's smile didn't waver, but her gaze sharpened. "Then we'll find someone else, someone less deserving, perhaps. Someone who doesn't share your vision, your values." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "And wouldn't that be a shame? To see everything you've built, everything you believe in, twisted into something unrecognizable?" Daniel's blood ran cold. This was no simple offer. It was a threat, a veiled warning that if he didn't play along, they would destroy everything he cared about. "Take some time to think about it," Victoria murmured, straightening. "But don't take too long, Mr. Matthews. Opportunities like this don't come twice." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Daniel staring after her, his mind racing. He knew now that he was caught in a game far more dangerous than he had realized. And the stakes, his life, his integrity, and the very soul of the community he had sworn to protect. The days that followed Victoria Cartwright's visit were marked by a heavy, suffocating silence. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that his every move was being watched. The sense of dread that had been building inside him since Noah's departure grew stronger with each passing day, wrapping around his chest like a vice. He'd barely slept, every creak of the floorboards or distant murmur of voices making him jump. It was as if the peaceful bookstore that had once been his refuge was slowly transforming into a cage. It was late one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, that everything changed. Daniel was sitting alone in the bookstore's back room, nursing a cup of cold coffee and staring blankly at the stack of cash he'd hidden away in a locked drawer. The sight of it filled him with unease. He'd thought about reporting it, about going to the authorities, but what would he say? That a mysterious group of strangers was trying to buy him out, to bend him to their will? He had no proof, only suspicions and a gut feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. As he sat there lost in thought, the bell above the front door chimed softly. Daniel's head snapped up, his pulse quickening. He'd locked the door, hadn't he? He stood slowly, his body tense, and crept toward the front of the store. The shop was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside casting eerie shadows across the rows of books. For a moment, Daniel thought he was imagining things, until he saw a figure standing in the center aisle. Drenched from the rain, their shoulders slumped. It was Noah. The sight of him sent a jolt of shock and relief through Daniel's system. "Noah," he whispered, his voice strangled with disbelief. "Is that really you?" Noah turned slowly, his face pale and gaunt, eyes shadowed with exhaustion and something darker, something that looked very much like despair. "I'm sorry, Daniel," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to drag you into this." Daniel took a hesitant step forward, his heart hammering in his chest. "What's going on, Noah? Who are these people? Why are they after you?" Noah flinched, glancing around nervously as if expecting someone to burst through the door at any moment. "We don't have much time," he whispered urgently. "They're probably already watching us." Daniel's skin prickled. "Who, Noah? Who's watching us?" Noah hesitated, then took a deep breath, his hands trembling at his sides. "My name isn't Noah," he said softly, his gaze locking with Daniel's. "It's Adrian. Adrian Cartwright. I'm Victoria Cartwright's son." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He stared at the young man, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. "You're her son?" he repeated numbly. Adrian, Noah, gave a bitter laugh. "Surprised? I don't blame you. She goes to great lengths to make sure nobody knows about me. I'm the family secret, the disappointment." His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked away, blinking rapidly. Daniel felt a surge of anger and confusion swell up inside him. "But why were you here? Why were you hiding? Why all this?" He gestured around helplessly, trying to encompass the madness that had descended on his life since that stormy night. "Because I ran away," Adrian whispered, his shoulders hunching, as if the weight of the truth was crushing him. "I tried to get out, to escape her and them. But I was a fool to think I could. They're too powerful, too connected. Everywhere I go, they find me. They always find me." Daniel swallowed hard, the room seeming to tilt around him. "Who are they, Adrian? What is this organization?" Adrian laughed again, the sound hollow and broken. "They're not an organization. They're a syndicate, a network of the most powerful people in the country. Businessmen, politicians, media moguls. They have their fingers in everything. Money, power, influence. They use it to control people, to manipulate entire communities. And my mother, Victoria, she's one of their top operatives." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. A syndicate? Control. This wasn't just a wealthy family looking to expand their business. This was something far, far more dangerous. "And you?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Why were you running?" Adrian's expression twisted with pain. "Because I saw what they do. I saw how they ruin people's lives if they don't cooperate. I saw them turn decent, honest people into puppets. And when I tried to speak out, tried to leave, they locked me up, kept me in their mansion like a prisoner." He looked up at Daniel, his eyes blazing with desperation. "I had to get out. I couldn't let them use me. But now I'm afraid I've just put you in their sights. You were kind to me, and now they want to use you too." Daniel shook his head, his heart pounding. "Why, Adrian? What do they want with me?" "Leverage," Adrian whispered. "You're respected, Daniel. People in this town listen to you. They trust you. And they know that if you can be bought, if you can be controlled, then anyone can. You're a symbol, a test. They want to see if they can corrupt even someone like you." Daniel felt the floor drop out from under him. A test? A pawn in some twisted game of power and influence? The thought made his stomach churn. "But I haven't agreed to anything," he said hoarsely. "I've turned down every offer." "They're not going to take no for an answer," Adrian murmured, his voice bleak. "They never do." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Daniel stared at the young man, this scared, broken boy who had stumbled into his life and shattered it with nothing more than the truth. And yet, as the shock began to wear off, something else took its place: determination. He had spent his entire life standing up for what was right, for helping others even when it meant putting himself at risk. And now here he was, being asked to make a choice that could destroy everything he'd worked for. But there was one thing Daniel knew for certain. He would not become a puppet. He would not let them turn him into a tool of manipulation and deceit. Noah, Adrian, he corrected himself, his voice firm. We're going to get you out of here. I don't know how, and I don't know where, but I'm not letting them take you. I'm not letting them win. Adrian stared at him, shock and hope flickering in his eyes. Daniel, you don't understand. If you try to help me, if you even think about going against them, they'll destroy you. They'll destroy everything. Maybe, Daniel said quietly, but I'd rather lose everything than become like them. For a long moment, Adrian didn't speak. Then slowly, a small broken smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. You're different, he whispered. I knew it that night. I knew you were different. Daniel reached out, squeezing his shoulder gently. We're getting out of here, he repeated firmly. But first, I need to know everything. I need to know exactly who we're up against. Adrian took a deep, shuddering breath, then nodded. Okay, he whispered. But once I tell you, there's no going back. I understand, Daniel said softly. Tell me everything. And so as the rain continued to patter softly against the windows, Adrian Cartwright, Noah, began to speak. He told Daniel about the network of power and corruption his mother was part of, about the people they had destroyed, the lives they had shattered. He told him about the other towns where they had set up shop, using small businesses like Daniel's as fronts for their influence. But most chilling of all, he told him about the ones who had tried to resist. They don't just ruin you financially, Adrian whispered, his face ashen. They go after your family, your friends. They make sure there's nothing left of you. They make an example out of you. Daniel's blood turned to ice. He thought of the people in this town, the neighbors, the friends who had become his family. If Victoria's group turned their sights on them, no, he wouldn't let it happen. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, Daniel would protect them, even if it meant facing down a monster far bigger than himself. Stay here, he murmured to Adrian. Just stay hidden for now. I need to think. As Daniel stepped back into the dark, empty store, his heart hammered with a mix of fear and resolve. He was in over his head. He knew that. But he also knew something else, something that gave him strength. He would not be broken, no matter what they threw at him. He had faced storms before, and he would face this one too. The bookstore was quiet, bathed in the soft golden glow of the early morning light filtering through the windows. Yet for Daniel Matthews, the silence felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of choices he never thought he'd have to make. He sat at his small kitchen table, hands clasped tightly around a half-empty mug of cold coffee, staring blankly at the envelope Victoria had left behind. He hadn't opened it. He didn't need to. He already knew what it contained. Another offer, another veiled threat dressed up as an opportunity. For the past few days, every word Adrian had spoken haunted him. The young man's warnings echoed in his mind. They'll destroy you. They'll destroy everything. The fear in Adrian's voice, the hopelessness in his eyes, Daniel couldn't get it out of his head. And yet what weighed on him even more was the look of determination that had crossed Adrian's face when he'd asked Daniel to help him escape. As if, in that one moment, he truly believed there might be a way out of this nightmare. But was there? Daniel rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion pulling at his every bone. What could an old man like him do against an organization as powerful as the Cartwrights? They had connections, influence, resources, things Daniel could never hope to match. And even if he tried to help Adrian escape, where would they go? Victoria's group seemed to have eyes everywhere. It was only a matter of time before they caught up to them, before they brought the full force of their wrath crashing down on anyone who dared to defy them. And then there was the town. Daniel glanced out the window, watching as his neighbors went about their morning routines. Mrs. Ferguson watering her flowers, old Mr. Graham chatting with the postman, children laughing as they ran down the street on their way to school. This was his home. These were his people. They trusted him, looked up to him. He couldn't put them in danger. Not for some idealistic, reckless attempt to stand up to a group that could crush them all with a snap of their fingers. But if he didn't stand up to them, if he let them twist him, use him, what then? How long before the people he cared about became pawns in their game? How long before his own hands were stained with the same corruption that had ruined Adrian's life? You're a symbol, Adrian had said softly. If they can break you, they can break anyone. Daniel closed his eyes, the pain in his chest almost unbearable. What kind of choice was this? Sacrifice everything he believed in, let himself be used as a tool for manipulation and deceit, or risk losing the very community he dedicated his life to protecting? Damn it, he whispered hoarsely, his voice breaking the stillness of the empty kitchen. He felt like a man caught between a rock and a hard place. No escape in sight. And all because of a single selfless act of kindness on a rainy night. A sudden, sharp knock at the door shattered the silence. Daniel jolted, his heart leaping into his throat. He stared at the door, dread curling in his stomach. It was too early for visitors. And after everything that had happened, he couldn't shake the feeling that whoever stood on the other side was not a friend. Slowly, he rose from the table and made his way to the door, his pulse hammering in his ears. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and opened it. Victoria Cartwright stood on his doorstep, a serene smile on her face. "Good morning, Daniel," she said softly, her voice smooth and polite as always. She was dressed impeccably, as if she hadn't a care in the world. But there was something in her eyes, something sharp and calculating, that made the hair on the back of Daniel's neck stand on end. "Victoria," he replied stiffly, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "What are you doing here?" Her smile widened ever so slightly. "I thought I'd drop by and see how you're doing. You've been awfully quiet lately." Daniel clenched his jaw. "I've been thinking." "About my offer?" she asked, her gaze boring into him. There was no warmth in her expression now, only a cold, predatory curiosity. "Have you made a decision?" The words seemed to hang in the air between them, thick with unspoken threats. Daniel swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "I need more time," he said finally, hating the way his voice wavered. Victoria tilted her head, studying him with a look that made his skin crawl. "Time is a luxury, Daniel. You see my associates. They're not known for their patience. They believe in taking action, swiftly, decisively." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Was that a warning? Had they already started moving against him? "And I would hate," Victoria continued softly, "to see them take an interest in something that's precious to you." Daniel's blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" he whispered. She stepped closer, her smile never wavering. "You've built a life here, Daniel. A good life. A quiet life. But quiet lives can be disrupted so easily, can't they? One bad investment, one health scare, one little accident, and everything can come crashing down." "Are you threatening me?" Daniel asked, his voice low and dangerous. Victoria's eyes glittered. "I'm offering you a way out, a way to protect everything you care about. All you have to do is accept the partnership, work with us, use your influence to guide your community in the right direction." "And what if I don't?" he asked, his throat tight. Her smile faded. "Then you'll lose more than just this bookstore. You'll lose your reputation, your friends, your entire world." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've seen it happen before, Daniel. Decent, hardworking people turned into shells of who they once were, because they were too proud, too stubborn to see the opportunity in front of them." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to tell her to leave, to slam the door in her face, to shout that he would never let them turn him into a puppet. But he couldn't. The fear, the uncertainty, it froze the words in his throat. Victoria watched him for a long moment, then sighed softly, shaking her head. "I don't want that for you, Daniel. You're better than that, smarter than that." She straightened, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from her coat. "Take the day. Think about what I've said. But make no mistake, by the end of this week, you will give me an answer." With that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. Daniel stood in the doorway, staring after her, his chest tight with a mixture of rage and fear. He couldn't let her win. He couldn't let them destroy everything he stood for. But what could he do? How could he fight back against something this powerful, this relentless? His thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm of doubt and desperation as he shut the door and leaned heavily against it. He needed a plan. He needed to protect the town, the people he loved. But most of all, he needed to protect Adrian. Because if Victoria found out he was hiding her son, there would be no coming back from that. Daniel took a deep, shuddering breath, his resolve hardening. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. He would not become their pawn. He would not let them break him. He'd made it through storms before. He would survive this one too, somehow, whatever it took. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. Every knock at the door made Daniel's heart leap into his throat. Every time the phone rang, he half expected it to be Victoria's smooth, taunting voice on the other end, demanding his answer. The stress was suffocating, the weight of the decision crushing him. He felt like a man trapped in quicksand. Struggling only seemed to pull him deeper. But then, late one evening, when he thought his nerves couldn't take any more, there was a knock at the back door of the bookstore. Daniel froze, his heart pounding. No one ever came to the back door, not unless they were trying to avoid being seen. With a sense of dread tightening his chest, he made his way to the back room, every instinct screaming at him to turn around, to run. But he couldn't. Slowly, he unlocked the door and pulled it open. Adrian stood on the other side, drenched in sweat, his eyes wild with fear. "Adrian," Daniel breathed, relief and panic crashing over him in equal measure. "What are you doing here? I told you to stay hidden." "There's no time," Adrian gasped, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "They found me, Daniel. I don't know how, but they found me." Daniel's blood ran cold. "What do you mean they found you?" Adrian pushed past him into the room, his movements frantic and desperate. "They came to the house I was staying at. I barely got out. They're looking for me, Daniel. They'll be here any minute." Panic surged through Daniel, his mind racing. If the Cartwrights knew Adrian was here, if they knew he was helping him, then everything was about to come crashing down. He turned to Adrian, grabbing his shoulders. "Listen to me," he said urgently, staring into Adrian's terrified eyes. "You have to go. Right now. Get out of town, get as far away as you can." "And go where?" Adrian whispered, his voice shaking. "They'll find me wherever I go. It's hopeless, Daniel. They'll never stop." The sound of tires crunching on gravel made them both go still. Daniel's heart plummeted as he turned toward the small window overlooking the back alley. Headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the narrow alleyway. A sleek black SUV rolled to a stop just a few feet from the door. "No," Daniel breathed, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. "No, no, no!" He turned back to Adrian, his mind racing. There was no time, no way out. They were trapped. "Get upstairs," he hissed, shoving Adrian toward the stairs leading to the small loft above the bookstore. "Hide. Don't make a sound." "But go!" Daniel snapped, his voice harsh with fear. Adrian hesitated for only a second, then bolted up the stairs, his footsteps light and silent. Daniel stood there for a moment, chest heaving, trying to force his panicked thoughts into some semblance of order. Then the back door swung open. Daniel turned, his heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst out of his chest. Victoria Cartwright stepped inside, flanked by two large men in dark suits. Her eyes swept over the small room, taking in every detail with that cold, calculating gaze. "Good evening, Daniel," she said softly, her voice dripping with false warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. What do you want?" Her smile was sharp, predatory. "I think you know why I'm here." One of the men stepped forward, his gaze hard and unblinking. "Where is he?" Daniel's pulse roared in his ears. "Who?" Victoria's smile faded, replaced by a look of steely impatience. "Don't play games, Daniel. You know exactly who I'm talking about. My son." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. I haven't seen him," he stammered. "I don't know where he is." Victoria tilted her head, studying him with a gaze that made his skin crawl. Is that so? He forced himself to nod, trying to keep his expression calm. But he could feel the lie burning on his tongue, and he knew she could see it too. She sighed softly, shaking her head. You're a terrible liar, Daniel. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his face. Where is he? I told you, Daniel said, his voice shaking. I don't. Enough! Her voice cracked like a whip, cutting through the air. She turned to the two men behind her, her expression cold and commanding. Search the place, top to bottom. Don't leave a single book unturned. The men nodded and moved toward the stairs. Panic flared in Daniel's chest. Number. He couldn't let them find Adrian. He couldn't let them take him. Wait, he blurted, stepping forward. The men paused, glancing back at Victoria for direction. She raised an eyebrow, looking faintly amused. Yes, Daniel. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. I'll give you what you want, he said slowly, hating the words even as they left his mouth. I'll sign the papers. I'll accept the partnership. Just leave him alone. Victoria's eyes widened slightly in surprise, and then a slow, triumphant smile spread across her lips. Really? She purred. You'd do that? You'd give up everything just to protect him? Daniel clenched his jaw, the bitterness of defeat rising like bile in his throat. Yes. She tapped a finger against her lips, considering him thoughtfully. You know, Daniel, I always knew you were a decent man. Too decent, perhaps, but I never imagined you'd be willing to sacrifice everything for a boy you barely know. I'm not doing it for him, Daniel said softly, his voice steady now. I'm doing it because I won't let you turn me into a monster like you. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, something dark and dangerous. Then just as quickly it was gone, replaced by her usual cool, calculated demeanor. Well, she said lightly, shrugging one slim shoulder, I suppose we can come to an arrangement. She turned to the men, gesturing dismissively. Stand down. They hesitated, clearly confused, but one look from Victoria sent them backing away from the stairs. Daniel's entire body sagged with relief, his knees nearly buckling. But the feeling was short-lived, because Victoria stepped closer, her eyes boring into his with a terrifying intensity. You'll sign the papers tomorrow morning, she said softly, and once you do, you'll keep your mouth shut about what happened here tonight. You'll do exactly as you're told. No questions asked. Understood? Daniel stared at her, every muscle in his body screaming to fight, to resist. But there was no way out. Not now. Not without putting Adrian and everyone else at risk. Slowly he nodded. Good, she murmured, a satisfied smile curving her lips. She reached out, patting his cheek gently. You made the right choice, Daniel. You'll see. Then she turned and swept out of the room, her guards trailing silently behind her. Daniel stood there shaking, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He had done it. He had saved Adrian. But at what cost? He glanced up at the stairs, where Adrian stood half hidden in the shadows, his face pale and stricken. Why? Adrian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Why did you do it? Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. Because, he said quietly, some things are worth more than pride, and I won't let them destroy you too. Adrian stared at him, disbelief and gratitude mingling in his gaze. But you just... I know, Daniel murmured, his chest aching. I know. He looked around the small empty store, the place he had built with his own hands, the place that had been his life's work. Tomorrow it would all be gone, taken from him, but at least Adrian would be safe. At least, he told himself fiercely, he had kept that one promise. And as the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, Daniel stood there in the quiet, empty bookstore, his heart heavy but his resolve unbroken. They hadn't won. Not really, because he was still standing, and he always would be. The bookstore's bell chimed softly as Daniel turned the key in the lock for the last time. The small shop, his life's work, now stood empty behind him. Shelves bare, the familiar smell of old paper and ink replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness. The for sale sign hung crookedly in the window, an eerie reminder of what once had been a sanctuary for dreamers and storytellers. And now it would be just another acquisition for the Cartwrights, a tool in their game of influence and control. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the crisp morning air fill his lungs. It was done. He had signed the papers, handed over the keys, and walked away from everything he had built. But even as his heart ached with loss, there was a strange, quiet calm settling within him. He had made a choice to protect the people he loved, to protect Adrian, even if it meant giving up everything he held dear. But what now? What happened to a man who had given up everything he had? As he turned away from the store, he spotted Adrian standing across the street, watching him with a look of profound sadness and guilt. The boy's shoulders were hunched, his eyes downcast. He looked lost, adrift, like someone trying to find his place in a world that had turned against him. "Daniel," Adrian called softly as he approached, his voice thick with emotion. I, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. If I hadn't—" "Stop," Daniel interrupted gently, shaking his head. He placed a hand on Adrian's shoulder, squeezing it reassuringly. "None of this is your fault. It was my choice." Adrian shook his head vehemently, tears glistening in his eyes. "But you shouldn't have had to make it. You shouldn't have to lose everything just to save me." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then sighed softly. "Adrian, there are things in this world that are worth more than money or a business. Things like kindness, integrity, the ability to look at yourself in the mirror and know you did the right thing, even when it hurt." Adrian's gaze dropped, his shoulders trembling. "But they took everything from you. Your store, your livelihood." "They didn't take everything," Daniel murmured, his voice steady. He glanced back at the bookstore, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You see, a building, a shop, those things can be replaced, but doing the right thing, that's something no one can ever take away from you." Adrian swallowed hard, his eyes wide and searching. "But what are you going to do now? Where will you go?" Daniel looked around the quiet, familiar street, a bittersweet sense of nostalgia washing over him. He had spent his entire life here, poured his soul into this town. But maybe it was time to move on, to start fresh, to rebuild somewhere they couldn't reach him. "I don't know," he admitted softly. "But I do know one thing. I'm not giving up. I'm not letting them win." Adrian's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Daniel smiled, a small, determined smile that lit up his tired eyes. "I may have lost the bookstore, but they didn't take me. I'm still standing. And as long as I am, I can still fight. I can still help people. Maybe not here, not the way I used to, but I'll find a way." Adrian stared at him, awe and respect mingling in his gaze. You're not afraid of them, are you?" Daniel's smile widened, his expression fierce. "Oh, I'm terrified," he admitted with a low chuckle. "But that's the thing about fear, Adrian. It's only as powerful as you let it be. They want us to be scared. They want us to give up, to let them control us. But as long as we keep standing, as long as we keep fighting, they haven't won." For a long moment, Adrian didn't speak. Then slowly, he nodded, a new light of determination sparking in his eyes. "So, what do we do now?" Daniel glanced back at the bookstore one last time, then turned his gaze forward toward the horizon. He had lost everything, but he had gained something too, a sense of clarity, of purpose. The Cartwrights might have stripped him of his material possessions, but they hadn't broken him. And as long as he held on to that, he was still free. "We move forward," he said quietly. "We find a new place, a new way, and we build something even stronger." Adrian blinked, his mouth opening in surprise. "You mean, you're taking me with you?" Daniel's smile softened. "If you want to come, yes. I don't know what the future holds, Adrian, but I do know this. You deserve a chance to be free, truly free. And if you're willing to trust me, we'll figure it out. Together." Adrian's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of hope. "Together," he whispered, a small, tentative smile breaking through the sorrow. "Yeah, I'd like that." They stood there for a moment, side by side, staring out at the world that waited beyond the small town of Lakeside. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles to fight, more sacrifices to make. But Daniel was ready. Because in the end, it wasn't the store or the money that mattered. It was the values he stood for, the kindness he refused to surrender, the integrity he held on to, even when everything else was stripped away. And that, Daniel knew, was something the Cartwrights could never take. With a deep breath, he placed a hand on Adrian's shoulder and smiled. "Come on, kid," he murmured. "Let's go find out what comes next." And together they walked away from the ruins of one life and toward the promise of another. One built not on fear or greed, but on the quiet, unbreakable strength of a man who refused to give up. And that's the story of Daniel Matthews, a man who stood firm against impossible odds, choosing integrity and kindness over fear and corruption. His journey reminds us that even in the face of darkness, there's always a way to hold on to what's right. If you found this story inspiring, or if it moved you in any way, please give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more gripping stories like this one, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Your support means everything to us and helps keep these powerful narratives coming. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and keep standing tall.